So, welcome everyone to part two of our discussion about the history of Buddhism and Christianity. Now, I'm going to get into a quick recap as to why I chose this topic in particular, and also everything that was stated so far. A quick reason why, because Christianity and Buddhism are some of the most influential religious and philosophical systems on our Jedi system. So, when the Jedi were first created by George Lucas, his two main pillars of inspiration for the Jedi spirituality were Buddhism and Christianity. And hopefully, in this second part, we'll find out exactly why. But probably towards the end, for now, I would just like to share my screen and go through what was already mentioned so far. So basically, what we have is the idea that these two religions are very, very similar to each other. And not only that, but they've also contacted each other throughout history, starting with antiquity. So we might think that the bridge between these two has been somewhere in the 19th century, maybe, but no, it goes way back all the way to before even Christianity was Christianity. As groups of Buddhists actually lived in Egypt, according to archaeological evidence. And we know that belief in the Buddha and Buddhist practice was brought into the Roman Empire further by a group called the Manichaeans, who were a syncretic religion that blended Christianity and Buddhism. So they were responsible for bringing Buddhism to the Roman Empire and for bringing Christianity, or rather Christ, all the way over as far as China. So that's something very interesting. Now, after the Roman Empire became fully Christian, that is to say, Christianity became the only accepted religion, they started persecuting all the other religious cults and sects in the empire, including their old friends, the Manichaeans, who up until that point had been their brothers in arms, so to say, against persecution from Roman authorities. And that marked the basically the purge of anything that was related to Buddhism from Europe, because Christian monotheism would not allow any deviation from their newly formed dogma, and they branded anyone who would still hold any other kind of faith a heretic. The Manichaeans still survived in the Middle East, where the Muslims in some places allowed them to exist. We will find out what happened to them later, but for now, we will take a look centuries later, like in the 10th century. So this is already in the Middle Ages. We find that Manichaean influence in Armenia was kind of widespread, because when a group of Christians from there was transplanted into the Balkans by the Byzantine emperor, they started coming into Europe with some strange views. Strange to the Orthodox and Catholic churches, of course, but not strange to anyone who knows anything about Buddhism. So they identified as Christian, but they believed in reincarnation. They believed in liberating oneself from the cycle of endless suffering and reincarnation. And they believed in acceptance of the natural order. To this, they added a Gnostic style faith uh, idea based in dualism, which was essentially there's a God of light, which is the god of our spirits, our souls, and a destructive demiurge that created the physical plane, which is like a prison, and it's also linked to the whole reincarnation thing to them. They were vegetarians, just like the Buddhists, because they believe that eating any kind of living being would essentially just mean that you're eating a reincarnated soul. So that's and killing. So that was very bad for them. And they did eat fish because, due to the science of the time, they believed that fish were not actually living beings, but rather spontaneously generated by the ocean. Another fun fact about medieval science.
It
Uh, but
was
yeah,
Aristotelian.
yes, exactly. And well, at least they could eat some fish. But the Cathars are important because now we can see. Well, at first they were called Bogomils in the Balkans, and they moved west. We can see on the map here just how far they actually managed to spread. You could find them in Italy, all the way up to southern Italy. You can find them in France, all across France. You can even find them down in Spain. Spain at the time, of course, was not fully Christian. It was well, more than half controlled by the Cordoba Caliphate, the Muslim rulers at the time. But yeah, pretty much a huge swath of what would be Christianity was being populated by this new idea, which of course was not popular with the Orthodox or the Catholics. They all consider this a heresy and a dangerous one. The Orthodox first wrote to the Catholics about this, and the Catholics started doing what they did best, unfortunately, which was start the Inquisition. And that's right, the actual Inquisition was started in order to deal with these very dangerous heretics, well, dangerous to them. They formed the bureau that would root them out, and they started basically trying to get local lords, whatever these people would be, like local nobility, to just viciously attack them physically, which is very, very unfortunate. But we see a lot of episodes historically of them just being executed for their heresy, um, including at the famous citadel of Carcassonne, where large masses of them were either killed or driven out. We don't really know how many they were because it's more or less assumed by modern scholars that the Catholics were sort of trying to say that there's more of them that actually were, or that they were better organized than they actually were. But we do have writings from that time period, even from these people, specifically from the Cathars, and we know that not only did they believe in reincarnation, but they were also very egalitarian. They had female priests, and women could have a great standing in their society. And they didn't believe in any kind of ritual other than one specific ritual that they had, which was called the consolamentum. Basically, when one of them is getting close to death, the others would lay hands on that person, and from that moment on, the person can only drink water and forgoes all food, and eventually tries to go into some sort of fasting meditation type of period in order to break free from well, from the dharma, I guess, from of the karmic chains that bind them. So this is obviously very bad for the church, and the church managed to purge all of them. Even in places where the Catholic Church didn't actually have a jurisdiction, like in the Balkans, the uh, the Austrians and Hungarians managed to just come on down, conquer a bunch of the territories which are modern day Bosnia, Bulgaria, and parts of modern Romania. This is where the first Bogomils came in, and sort of the last bastions, I guess. And eventually they were either well, they shared the same fate as the others, or were assimilated into the broader population, forced to just become Christian. However, they were still treated as second-class citizens for a long time, and there's still evidence of their being there and their settlements because they did have separate settlements, funnily enough. So yeah, this is the first time in centuries, in which Christianity comes close to Buddhist ideas, and this is how they treat them. Very important to note this, because not long after, we find a very curious tale reaching Europe, and that's the tale of Varlam and Josaphat, or Barlam and Josaphat, depending on where you are. In the Orthodox calendar, it's Saint Varlam. Anyway, this story came to the Byzantians, that's the Orthodox Christians, again via the Manichaeans, who were by this point transcribing Buddhist stories into a Christian context after the centuries passed. And the Christians essentially thought that this was a long lost Christian saint that they were talking about, Saint Josaphat. But if we take a look at the story itself, we will find that it's essentially just the story of Gautama Siddhartha, the founder of Buddhism, with a whole bunch of elements replaced so that it's Christianity now that he's preaching and practicing, and not really yogic practice and whatever he was doing. I've put these two side by side. You can probably check them out later, but I'll point out the main ideas in both stories. So, of course, we have Gautama Siddhartha was born in northern India. When he was born, a yogic sage comes to his father and tells him that the boy will either become a great king or a great sage. Kept in a palace by his father, he escapes and sees suffering and tries to become ascetic. He studies with a number of yogis, reaches enlightenment, starts preaching, returns back to his family, converts them to his own system of belief, and dies at an old age. Now, Josaphat was, as we can see, born in India. So basically the same place, really. Um, it's not a yogi that comes to his father, it's a Christian monk that comes to his father and tells him pretty much the same thing, that either he will become a great king or a great Christian. His father obviously doesn't want him to become a great Christian. He wants him to become a great king, so he keeps him locked up in the palace. Same in both cases. He escapes the palace and sees this pretty much the same people suffering, and pretty much the same as Gautama Siddhartha does. And he goes to study with Saint Varlam and become a Christian monk. So again, yogi gets replaced with Christian, and that's pretty much the only thing that they did really. He travels around preaching Christianity and eventually manages to go back home, converts his father to Christianity. His father makes him king. This is where the stories diverge a bit because Gautama Siddhartha didn't become king of his father's kingdom, but in the Christian story, he does. And he forms a Christian kingdom in India, which also gets somehow referenced later on in history as a place that other Christians try to somehow locate and find because they still believe that this Christian kingdom of Josaphat is somewhere over there. But yeah, this story travels all across Europe. It becomes part of Catholicism, it becomes part of Orthodoxy, it just goes everywhere. Uh, the story is very popular because it shows Christian triumph over the pagan belief. Bit ironic if you ask me, but okay. And this is how The Buddha essentially becomes a Christian saint without anybody knowing it. And even in later centuries, when people like Marco Polo write about the type of religion that he sees in the Mongol Empire, actually writes about Buddha and he says that this Buddha character is very, very similar to our Saint Josephat. I wonder how that happened. Sort of situation that they have there. So yeah, they managed to so Buddhism managed to somehow come to Europe and integrate with Christianity, but only by pretending to be something else, just pretending to be Christianity on its own. And that's how, and they're still worshipped today, by the way. You can still find these guys in church, in calendars, and stuff. But for the next few centuries, there wouldn't be much contact between actual Buddhism and European Christianity, except for Marco Polo, which I mentioned, but that's hardly any credible source or real contact to begin with. However, when the when the Japanese were first discovered by Portuguese explorers, all that began to change because the Japanese were the first really Buddhist nation that they actually truly encountered. They had relationships with China, but they were mostly kept on the coast and not really allowed much influence in. But when they reached Japan, they actually tried to convert the local population, and this is when a certain Francis Xavier traveled to Japan in order to actually make it a Christian country on behalf of the Portuguese. And when he did so, he came from India because he was also trying to convert people in India, which was actually quite successful according to him. And when he reached Japan, he was hoping that he could try to get people to get rid of their idols and convert to Catholicism. And what he found was that the religion practiced, the Buddhism practiced in Japan was so similar to Christianity in so many ways that he actually wrote that he thought that the Christian teachings were somehow reached this place, but that this Buddha character, or rather Shakwa, as he called him, somehow corrupted them to put himself at their forefront, and therefore he must set them straight. And at the same time, the Buddhists, noticing the similarities between what he was preaching and their own system, essentially just thought that he was another Buddhist teacher from India because they knew he was coming from India. So they just assumed, also due to the language barrier, that he was just teaching them about a new kind of Buddhism. And then they also thought that it was one of their own sects that he was preaching, namely the Shingon sect. And then they just started. There's a reason why they start writing in the period that the Shingon sect is very popular in India, you, mostly because they thought that Xavier was representative of that sect. And he came to Japan, he preached for about 2 years, and then he left, and nobody was the wiser. He thought that he was converting his people to Christianity, and they thought that he was a Buddhist monk from a foreign country. And of course, he died somewhere else trying to do the same thing. But yeah, this is a very important point to make because we noticed how similar these things are, these two religions are at their basic level, even when people don't really understand each other very well. And especially when they first come to each other. Of course, we also, if you want to go deeper into this, you can find Xavier's dialogue with a Zen monk yeah, but of the monastery that he talked to, he was very frustrated with what the monk had to say about the nature of reality. He didn't quite understand much of it, but also what he did understand, he didn't really like. And the Buddhists basically just listened to him very patiently, while he and all the other missionaries that followed were not patient with Buddhism. And that was also an issue which began to get bigger and bigger when it came to the relationship between Christianity and Buddhism in Japan and then later China, when the local Buddhist clergy would just try to expel the Christians simply based on the fact that they were not trying to understand any other point of view other than their own and pushing their dogma as absolute truth. No surprise there, but also important to point out. Uh, in fact, this is why we even see this in China right after they failed to convert Japan after decades of presence there. They were expelled, the Christians, I mean, and they moved to China where they tried the same thing, a bit more soft this time. They didn't try to push their ideas that hard, and it was kind of working until the same thing happened. Buddhist monks, particularly the Chan school, which was also Zen in Chinese, um, were always complaining to the authorities about how the Christians are simply not syncretic. At the time, Chinese religious syncretism was at an all-time high. They were making huge connections between Taoism, Buddhism, and even the philosophy of Confucianism, merging them together in different ways. Buddhism was highly respected, and Christianity was against, well, pretty much all of that, because we can't have religious syncretism beyond the first centuries of Christianity, unfortunately.
Huh?
Yes? You wanted to say something?
No,
Right.
I didn't
So,
find that to be exact, but go ahead.
yes, yes. I was just trying to express how exactly. So, anyway, centuries passed in which Christianity was the dominant force in Europe, but also fragmenting. And in China, we find that Christianity started being outlawed mostly in the 19th century when find this wonderful gentleman, Hong Xiuquan, who legitimately thought he was the brother of Jesus Christ. And he spread his version of Christianity along with a huge rebellion that took up most of southern China at some point. And his Christian cult essentially ruled southern China for a long time until he was eventually defeated by the Qing dynasty and their and their armies. And of course, this put Christianity in a very, very problematic light because essentially this man was converted to Christianity by the missionaries they were allowing into the country. So Christianity started being very, very stifled in China as a result of what happened with the famous Taiping Rebellion. But Buddhism was also fluctuating during this time period. Sometimes you would have a Buddhist resurgence, sometimes you would find outlaw banning of Buddhism, like outright in China, while it was still very important and popular in Japan. But something very interesting happened about the same time in Europe, which was, of course, the Enlightenment. We all know what transpired then. Rationalism secularism, all sorts of wonderful isms that transformed European society to the core. And somewhere sneaking in, we find an interest in Eastern philosophy. And this is where we find Buddhism becoming interesting to the free thinkers of Europe, which were separating themselves from the religious dogma of Christianity and trying to figure out what else is out there and what else is interesting. Um, and of course, we're free to do so because up until that point, the Christian church or churches were rather unanimous in condemning Buddhism and Eastern spirituality as a sort of incomplete, misguided form of philosophy. This was their general concept of it. Of course, this begins to change. So we see that in the East, in China, religion is viewed as something rather dangerous due to the fact that it can start rebellions, and not just Christianity, but any kind of religion can starts being viewed as suspicious. While in the East, we see in the West, we see some interesting opening towards those very same ideas, and this rift will become more apparent as the centuries go by. In the 19th century, we find Arthur Schopenhauer, who was particularly influential in spreading Buddhist ideas, talking about Buddhist philosophy, and pretty much influencing a lot of the big thinkers in later time periods. People such as Nietzsche, Jung, and even Sigmund Freud were practically introduced to Buddhism by Schopenhauer's writings. And not just them, just a lot of people who were studying, especially in Germany at the time, even Romanian writers, everyone who was in that place at that time was getting influenced by Schopenhauer's very, very popular ideas. Of course, he wasn't the only one who was doing this. We find other scholars all across Europe translating Buddhist writings. Um, Basically thinking about them, writing how they relate romanticism to the current ideas of the times, to other types of philosophy. It was becoming very, very interesting to Western thinkers in particular to talk about Buddhism and to look deeper into Buddhism, which also segued into a deeper interest into Eastern philosophies as a whole. India was being viewed a bit differently because of this. So because they understood that Buddhism is rooted in India, they were also looking at Hinduism. And yeah, but Buddhism was essentially the lens tip, so to say, which got everybody so excited. The 19th century pretty much um, allowed for the 20th century to build up on this trend. So Buddhism became even more interesting on a philosophical level, even more interesting to the historians of religions. And we find, of course, people such as Joseph Campbell, who was always fascinated by all sorts of philosophies and ideas and mythologies. As we all know, no need to go into too much detail there, but also very interested in Buddhism. Um, Mircea Eliade, who did a lot of great work on basically solidifying the concept of a history of religion, and who taught at the University of Chicago.
He founded the comparative religions.
Exactly. Exactly. Um, Also very interested in Buddhism and later on Hinduism, and he even traveled to India to find out more from the source. Ninian Smart actually wrote a book, Buddhism and Christianity, Rivals and Allies. Very good read if you haven't tried it yet. Definitely topical. And of course, we have Carl Gustav Jung, who basically used a lot of Buddhist practice in his psychological work. He was very, very interested in the way Buddhism works with the psyche, and even took up the practice of the Tibetan Buddhist practice of using mandalas in order to focus the mind for meditation. And of course, he adapted it to his own ideas, but he even has his mandalas drawn in his red book, the medieval style manuscript that he wrote and drew, I guess. And but these are historians of religion. These are people who are interested in metaphysics. But we also find that even Albert Einstein, who was a friend of Jung, was very much interested in Buddhism, and he believed that it would be the religion of the future. This is I didn't put in the direct quote from him, but this is paraphrasing generally what he was saying, that he believed that Buddhism would essentially evolve to be the religion that the new world that they were stepping in at the time would adopt on its own. Maybe he was right, maybe he was wrong, who's to say? But even somebody such as him, and he wasn't the only scientist, hard scientist that was into Buddhism. It was generally very, very popular across the literati, so to say. Not so much during for the lay people, I guess. People in villages and small towns were still very, very Christian, but in the big cities, people were definitely getting into this. Um, as an aside, they even built a Buddhist crematorium called the Dharma Crematorium in Romania, a very Orthodox country. And there's not a lot of crematoriums in any Orthodox country. Like I think they recently had one constructed in Greece because Orthodoxy doesn't allow cremation. And this crematorium was built during the late 19th century, specifically for people who were sort of more interested in Buddhism uh, than the local religions, because it was so we see that even lay people, so to say, were going into this, but not a lot of them, unfortunately. Anyway, this widespread of Buddhism in academia and psychology allowed, at least in America, for a wider spread of it during in non-literary circles, let's say, because we find that in the 1960s, of course, a large number of the counterculture movement, the people who were trying to dissociate themselves from broader society, were heavily into Zen Buddhism. Um, and they all started congregating around San Francisco as a very important Buddhist site. Now, San Francisco is not a Buddhist site from that period. It's even older because in the 19th century, you find a lot of Buddhist temple constructed by Chinese and Japanese immigrants, which were then frequented in the 1960s by people of all different backgrounds that were trying to get into Buddhism. And Japanese priests, Zen teachers were coming in. And here I actually brought a very interesting image of an old or Catholic Gothic cathedral, which is currently a Buddhist temple. It's a Zen Buddhist temple, and we find a wonderful statue of Buddha inside an altar. So very, very syncretic indeed. This is modern day San Francisco, still a very important center for Buddhism. And why is this relevant to the conversation more or less? Well, it's because a certain George Lucas lived there at some point, and he was highly influenced by the very Buddhist society that existed in San Francisco, and many times he described himself as a San Francisco Buddhist practitioner. So yes, we can definitely see where this Buddhism is coming from. Now, there's a slight difference between the Buddhism we see in San Francisco and in the West in general, and the Buddhism practiced in well, in the East. And that's because it's in the West, it's mostly philosophical with all the religious parts removed, while in the East, it's usually a mix of both. But the monks in their monasteries generally just remove the religious parts in their practice. However, they outwardly encourage them for the lay people. Due to the fact that in the West, our Buddhism was popularized by people such as Schopenhauer and Jung and all the rest. They were most interested in the philosophical aspects, not so much the religious rituals and all of that. And this is also the kind of Buddhism that people such as Alan Watts came into contact with, which we will be discussing now briefly. Alan Watts actually started learning and studied Zen with D.T. Suzuki in London. And this is the beginning of his spiritual journey. So I always thought that Watts was essentially a Christian at first, and then he became a priest, and then he got into Zen, but apparently it was the other way around. He actually started with Zen and continued with Zen when he moved to America. And after uh, all of the Zen, he actually became an Episcopalian priest. And then he started teaching Eastern philosophy at university after that wasn't really his cup of tea anymore. The reason why we're talking about him, of course, is because he was very, very, very influential in California in the times prior to George Lucas creating Star Wars. And Lucas never actually mentioned Watts as an inspiration, but he was literally on the radio all the time with his lectures. He was very popular in the time period, and I find it impossible for Lucas to not have either been in contact with his words or influenced by them in some way. And he's definitely, the things that he says are definitely very much in line with what we practice and believe as Jedi. So, very, very important character and also very important propagator of Buddhist teaching in America and beyond, because he was also very popular in England around the same time. And I'm not so sure how popular he was in the rest of Europe, the non-Anglo sphere, I guess, but definitely, definitely popular in these two countries as a public thinker and philosopher. Um, After which we come to the logical conclusion of all of this going through the centuries. We find that George Lucas read a lot of Joseph Campbell's work from a very young age and had it in his head that this hero's journey thing is very, very good and very, very interesting. Um, he was born in a Christian family and raised in a Christian family. He says that at age 6, he had a spiritual revelation or vision, which made him question the very nature of reality. He never went into any detail as to what that was. I kept searching and searching and searching, and I could never find any kind of interview or book or anything detailing exactly what George Lucas saw. But maybe we'll find out one day. And of course, he moved to San Francisco, where he got into Buddhism, and that changed his life. He describes himself as a Buddhist Methodist, and in fact, that's what he tells his children that they should identify as. And it's not a secret to anyone that the spirituality of the Jedi, as it appears in the original trilogy, is essentially Zen Buddhism mostly. But of course, the way he made the Jedi out to be, we see that they are Zen monks wearing the habit of a Christian monk. So the two types of monks come together into the Jedi. Again, hinting at the merger of Christianity and Buddhism as an idea, even visually. And he actually met Joseph Campbell, but he met him pretty much after the movies were done, like in 1985. And in 88, we actually find Campbell on the premises of Skywalker Ranch, filming his wonderful series, The Power of Myth, which we're all very familiar with, I guess. And from there, the rest is, well, lived history because we all live it now. So this is how all these centuries come together and they culminate with us. We are at the end of this vast chain of causes and effects that eventually congregated into this wonderful, wonderful syncretism that we have today. And we can have it today because things are a lot different. This would never have happened in late antiquity. This would not have happened in the Middle Ages. This could not have happened even during the Enlightenment period. It can only happen here and now after religious reconciliation, after interconfessional dialogue, after a lot of people researching and finding that we're not all that different after all, as trying to reach out across the aisle and actually being okay with this type of idea. So I guess that's it for my presentation. And if you would like, we can discuss further the implications of what was being said. I'm going to, no, in fact, I think I could just leave it here. People can see my face, right? Yeah, so I could probably just leave it like this for a while. If anyone has any questions about specific topics that were brought up,
I want to go to sleep. But
well,
not because, yeah, it's not because it was boring, it's because I'm just really tired.
it's understandable.
May I go to sleep now?
Of course, I can't hold you against your will. Thank you for being here and for listening.
Cheers, Rod. It was a fascinating talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
Anybody
that's
else?
super in depth. It was really cool. Thanks for putting that together.
Now, what I really wanted to say is that I probably didn't actually show it as much as I did in my other articles, but really these two things are very, very similar, and this is why we can blend them together so well in our own ideas. And this is also why it's not good to disparage anybody else's ideas because we see that historically, when this happened, we just didn't win. The people who disparaged the other people's opinions were eventually shunned, while the people who were very open to new ideas and who were syncretically building up bridges between their philosophies and ideas actually managed to keep on existing. all the way today. So that's very important to note because we usually tend to think about it the other way around. We tend to think that people who are very, very covetous of their own ideas and try to keep them and try to push them and try to make everybody else believe as them are actually winning somehow. But we long term we see that that's not really the case. But we also see that this happens time and time again, so it should tell us something about humanity as a whole. And also be very careful when signs of this occur again and when this type of person starts to emerge again. As we know what happens after, and that's not really. But on that grim note, yeah, I'm just going to end it here if nobody wants to say anything or add anything. Nobody? All right. Then I guess we can end the recording here. Is somebody's writing something in the chat? Let me see here. Oh wait, no.